One more time with the TV. Been a long week. The court just instructed you on the law. Over the last 3-4 days, you've heard all the evidence. You've heard the testimony from the witnesses. You've seen a lot of these exhibits. And what you do when you go back in the jury room to deliberate is you determine who was credible, who was not, what evidence is important, what evidence isn't. Mr. Creedmoor and I have our opinion. Defense counsel has their opinion. And you're fixing to hear our opinions. But there's only one opinion that matters, and that's the collective agreement opinion of the jury. Now, he just instructed you on the law. In the first crime, he instructed you on capital murder. Now, in all these crimes, they have elements, and we're required to prove each and every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's look at the elements of capital murder. On or about November 30th, 2022 in Tippah County, Mississippi. There's no dispute that he was murdered on November 30th of 2022. There's no dispute that it happened in Tippah County, Mississippi at his house on Canyon Road 600. While Jeff Spence was engaged in the commission of robbery, taking Kirby's belongings by force, with or without deliberate design, kill Kirby Carpenter, human being. Now, deliberate design is an important term. Deliberate design means that you went there meaning to kill him. It was premeditated. It was planned. We don't have to prove that in capital murder. And again, Kirby's last words to Caitlin via text were at 6:37 p.m. Those were his last words to Caitlin. Those were his last words to anybody. He goes dark after that. He's at Gino's. Been plenty of testimony that that's 15 to 20 minutes away from his house. So that puts him home around 7 o'clock. Scott Watson and Dr. Robinson, who is on the death certificate, declared Kirby's date of death was November 30th of 2022. There's our venue. Robbery is taking someone else's property by violence using a gun. A person is in the commission of a robbery even if the robbery occurs after a killing. That's an important concept in the law, in that you don't have to prove that you robbed him and then killed him. You could kill him and then rob him. And that's what that says. Even if Jeff robbed Kirby after killing him, Jeff is still in the commission of a robbery. It's all connected. With or without deliberate design. We know he was shot with a shotgun, 12-gauge shotgun, or a shotgun in his chest and neck area. And the autopsy report says he died of shotgun blast wounds. Now, if you don't think the state has met its burden that their robbery took place, that's the key element of capital murder. If you don't believe we've met our burden, then you consider first-degree murder. And again, the elements are fairly similar, that this took place on November 30th, 2022 in Tippah County. He unlawfully, willfully, and with deliberate design to effect the death of Kirby Carpenter. Now, in first-degree murder, we have to prove deliberate design. And we have proven this deliberate design. We have shown that this was planned out by Jeff Spence. He drove 9 hours to Mississippi to kill Kirby Carpenter. He'd been talking to Tracy Delp about paying him to kill him for 8 months before the murder. So this was planned out and deliberate. And killed Kirby Carpenter, human being. Deliberate design, again, it means a person decides to unlawfully kill the person with no legally justifiable or excusable reason. Now, the timeline is critical in this case. And we've divided it up, and you kind of move from here this way. The testimony was that Kirby and Caitlin start dating in 2020. In mid-2020, they move in together. They move in another house, and then they eventually moved out to County Road 600. July 23rd of 2022, Enola is born. Caitlin goes on 12 weeks of maternity leave. Between July and August, Jeff and Karen stay with Caitlin. There's a trip to Pennsylvania after that where they go to visit the Carpenter family up there. October 20th of 2022, Caitlin goes back to work. Jeff and Karen come to Mississippi to help take care of Enola. November 24th of 2022, everybody spends Thanksgiving together. And November 29th of 2022, the testimony was that Jeff and Karen get in the silver Cadillac and drive back to Saltville, Virginia at between 1 and 2 p.m. All right? Now keep in mind that Saltville, where they lived on Roan Lane at the time, is about 8 to 9 hours away. So that puts them there. That puts them home about midnight at the latest. All right? All right. November 30th, 2022, the day that Kirby was killed, was murdered. 5:30 a.m., Caitlin gets up, gets ready to go to work. Remember, she had to take Enola to Boonville and then drive to Collierville for work. She gets up at 5:30 a.m. and Kirby's still asleep. We move up to 9:26 a.m. and we'll get to the van in a minute, but the van tag on a maroon van owned by Jeff Spence, USF 8847, the van tag is red on I-81 South. About an hour south in the southbound lane from Saltville, about 7 hours from Tippecanoe. Now, given that time, now this is 9:26 a.m. Eastern time, so that's 8:26 here. So if you add 7 hours, he gets here about 4 o'clock. Oh, go back. All right, 6:11 p.m. The testimony was that Kirby is on camera at Kroger in Corinth, 6:11 p.m. buying lamb chops. That testimony came in from Mr. McAllister, I believe. 6:37. There's the text from Caitlin to Kirby. His response is Geno's tire store in Boonville. 7 to 7:15. Ben Holcomb testifies that he heard a single shotgun blast. At 7:31 p.m., after the shotgun blast, Caitlin is at Walmart in Boonville. There's an exhibit showing her with Enola at the Walmart in Boonville. 7:52 p.m., Caitlin leaves Walmart and picks up Chinese and heads home. So, we've covered November 30th, December 1st of 2022, no Kirby. The next day on 12/2/22 at 11:40 a.m. Eastern Time, which is 10:40 here, 2 hours before his body is discovered, Jeff Spence is opening up a bank box at the Chillowy Bank branch of the Bank of Marion in Virginia. We'll talk about that in a minute. 12:30 p.m. that day, 12/2, Caitlin finds Kirby's body, calls 911. She's on the phone with Maddie Jane. The next day, 12/3/22, Jeff and Karen come back to Mississippi. 12/4/2022, which has been referred to as the S show at the house. Jeff's filming. You saw the video of him and Casey. You also saw a very brief video of him filming the garage. That was strange to me. Why do you film the garage? That's where the shooting happened. There are no valuables in there. There's a bunch of garbage laying on the floor. 12/12/22. Mr. Spence goes back to Saltville. Now, I believe Karen stays in Mississippi, and he opens up another bank box at the Saltville branch of the Bank of Marion. Difference in this one is he doesn't enter that box. He entered the box at Chilhowee, or Chilhowee. 12/20/22. Jeff, Karen, and Caitlin all go back to Virginia. Remember, the funeral was on December 17th. They leave on 12/20/22. They take the black Suburban, and they go back. They don't return to Mississippi until they're arrested. They don't make any inquiries about how's the investigation going. Now, the van, which was spotted on I-81 on 12/30, on 1/20/23, about a month and a half after the murder, the fire-damaged van is hauled off and scrapped at Berry's scrapyard in Saltville, Virginia. All right. Now, at this point, what we know, Kirby died on November 30th of a gunshot wound about 7/7/15. Ben Holcomb's testimony. Kirby's last communication to anybody was 6:37. Caitlin was on camera at Walmart at 7:31. Now, the van. This is a 2002 GMC Safari. How did this come about? Well, Chris McAllister, the investigator from Tippah County, was reviewing some photos from Mr. Spence's camera or game camera on his property. Because up to that point, the concentration was on the Cadillac. But he has all these other cars. As Tracy Delp testified, he had a bunch of cars in his yard. So he sends, I think, 2 tag numbers to Russ Gordon at MBI and says, hey, run these. He runs and gets a hit on the GMC Safari through the CLEAR program he discussed. 9:36 a.m. Eastern Times, 8:36 Central. I-81 South, 7 hours from Ripley. All right, taken to the salvage yard 1/20/23. But let's go back to the pictures that Chris McAllister got. Here's the van clearly on 11/1/22. No fire damage. That's USF 8847 Virginia plate. Here's another picture. You can see the van in the background on 11/29/22. And then here is a picture of the van on 12/13/22, about 2 weeks after the murder. Still not burned. And there's a gap. The interesting thing here is Chris McAllister testified he found it interesting there was no activity on this camera from 11/29/22 to December 13th. Now, Russ Gordon gets a hit on the van on the 30th, and this report is generated with the tag number, license plate number, and the date range. There's a picture of the plate. There's a picture of the van. He also plugged the latitude and longitude coordinates that were given to him by the program into Google Earth, and the pin drop there shows the camera was located in the southbound lane of I-81, so he was heading south. That information is given to Brad Johnson at the Smith County, Virginia Sheriff's Department, and because the title had been run showing salvaged, he goes to Berry's, and there's the van, burned. This also came from Berry's, showing he was paid about $278. James Harper towed it for him. GMC van 2002, the VIN number, which matches the VIN number on all the other documents. Now, the van burns up. Guess what else burns up with it? Any evidence is in there. Any evidence. A month and a half after, it's salvaged. Remember, he'd driven that van to Mississippi before. Casey Barnes testified that he drove down here with a litter of puppies, and all the testimony has been that he sold dogs and sold them at First Monday. So she was familiar with that van. Ty Jones briefly testified, he's the Farm Bureau insurance man from Virginia, that the coverage was changed on the van that would have covered fire damage, but no claim was ever made. Although their house burned, they made a claim on that. Now, why would he not turn that claim in? They'll probably say, well, he wasn't going to get any money anyway. Well, there'd been an investigation. So he didn't want that. Now, let's talk about the shotgun. Remember the phone call that I played? There's a video. You can see Doug and Jeff Spence talking. And this is on 12/4 of 2023, after he's been arrested, and he's trying to get Doug, who lives in Pennsylvania, to come down and take care of some business for him. And then toward the end, he throws in, well, you might want to go look under the bed. Just see what's there. That was what was there. Shotgun wrapped in a blue coat. Guess what Casey Barnes testified he wore when it was cold? A blue coat. That's his coat. Now, this was found in the house at Charlie Taylor Drive, which they had moved to a rental house after their house on Roan Lane had burned. Why do you put a gun wrapped in a blue jacket under a bed and then tip your brother off to go look under the bed? Why? Because that's the murder weapon. Brad Johnson testified that he reviewed all these phone calls. And they got some tips on him on other places to search. But he said, and they found multiple guns. But there was never any comment made by Jeff Spence to Doug or anybody else that led them to a gun as that did. And he said after he heard that, it struck him funny. Now, had Doug Spence been able to get down here from Pennsylvania before the search was made, my guess is it wouldn't have been there. Also, that gun was fully loaded, partially with buckshot. I believe he said the red shells were buckshot and the others might have been birdshot. The shells were ejected by Brad. Now, let's talk about the Chilhowee branch. Again, this is the bank box that was open on 12/2/22, 2 hours before Kirby's body was discovered and 2 days after the murder. It was opened and accessed. Now, some people may say, "Well, how do you know he put anything in it?" Well, why would he log into that bank box? And on the Saltville branch, he opens the box, but he doesn't log in. Now, here's the safety deposit list showing that it was opened on 12/2/22. Here's the log. 11:40 a.m. That's Eastern time on 12/2 he enters. He doesn't go back to that box until September 25th of 2023. That's one of the things in the bank box at Chilhowee. A check to David Barnes for $90 on Kirby's account, signed by Kirby, that is absolutely worthless. bank receipts, bank money bands, and you recall that Casey Barnes said Kirby always carried a lot of money in that bag, and that he had some of it out on the table, and it was banded. But all of these receipts are from People's Bank in Ripley, Mississippi. They're worthless. Why are they in there? I'll tell you why. Because he was in a hurry. He didn't have time to go through everything he'd taken that night. So he just went there, and you remember Brad Johnson said this was all haphazardly put into the box. He just threw everything in there. Now, we aren't claiming that all this stuff belonged to Kirby Carpenter. There's some items of personal items that belong to the Spences. These are the boxes that Casey Barnes was picking up in that video. Andrea Dora found in A1 storage. In the chill-away box, you've got those paper items that are worthless, the check and all the receipts. We know that Kirby carried a lot of cash. And from Bart Adams' testimony, the estate attorney, there was very little cash in the estate. The only cash he said was the cash that was in Kirby's pocket when he was murdered. Now, I cannot identify, you got a dollar bill in your pocket, I could never say that's mine, because unless you write the serial numbers down, you're not going to know. Money's fungible. But Kirby had lots of money. There's very little money in the estate. Where'd the money go? He was fond of $2 bills. What was found in the Chillaway branch box? Casey Barnes, he loved $2 bills for some reason. Full of $2 bills. That's evidence that he robbed him the night he murdered him. All right. Remember the text from Karen to Caitlin, 11:30:22 at 8 p.m. Let's see. Dad and I are eating hamburgers in a few minutes. He just got up from a good nap. He worked hard today, inside and out. The hound dogs are back on the porch. The hound dogs are back on the porch. 8 o'clock p.m. The hunt was over by 8. The hunt was over at 7:15. Where was Karen? Never heard anything from her except a text message. She didn't come in here and say, yeah, I sent that, or, never heard from her. This is a cover Jeff's behind text. She knew what was going on. She knew.
He used 23 minutes, Mr. Mears.
Thank you. Is she tell it? Can I have some extra time? Let's talk about Caitlin. Is she telling everything? Is she telling all the truth? That's your decision. I think she's telling the truth about one thing, that her dad killed Kirby Carpenter. The question is, who were they involved with? Ray Palmer, the gang out of New York, out of Memphis, the swindled diamond dealers in Chattanooga, Adam Yates, although he was dead before Kirby died, David Hancock? No! Him! That's who they were involved with. But again, the truth she does tell is that her dad killed Kirby Carpenter. But they're not on trial. Jeff Spence is on trial. Let's talk about Tracy Dell. He introduced himself. If you remember, the first thing he said, I said, tell the jury your audience, I'm Tracy Dell, friend of Jeff Spence. He said Jeff was good to him. Gave him work. Their relationship, I think, started about 2020. He worked on cars for him. He tended to his animals, paid him, gave him a motorcycle, gave him cars. He was good to him. What did Tracy Delp get out of testifying? Absolutely nothing. He got a trip to Mississippi. He wasn't paid. He wasn't getting any favors from law enforcement. Why? Because Tippah County law enforcement and Smith County law enforcement don't have anything on him. Now, he may have some misdemeanor warrants in another county, but he wasn't going to be arrested. You saw him. He walked in here by himself. He drove down here by himself. Remember, he said it's like 9 or 10 hours, long ways. And after he got through testifying, he was out that door with his girlfriend. I don't know if we'll see Tracy around here anymore. He didn't want to be here. So he had no reason to lie. He's getting nothing out of this. Yeah, he's got a criminal history. He had a history of drug abuse. You heard all that. They weren't concerned about it. They named him as a witness. That's how we knew about him.
Objection, Your Honor. We do not.
I didn't, huh?
We named him as
Who's on the witness list?
on David Lips.
What? He's still listed.
I'll rule objection. Take money picture.
We wouldn't have known about him. I saw his name and I called Brad Johnson and said, who's this guy? Tried to find him, couldn't find him. Apparently, the defense couldn't find him, and we found him in January of this year. So they weren't worried about his history of, or at least the other attorneys weren't worried about drug use and criminal history. And besides, you heard him testify. He wasn't impaired. He was clear-headed. And he fully admitted his criminal history. Remember the Assassin's Inc. text. This was about a year before the murder. Jeff Spence says, you just manage it. You hire the talent. The older I get, the less life in prison is a deterrent. Tracy testified that Jeff Spence began talking to him about Kirby about 8 to 9 months before the murder. He tried to hire him to kill him. He said he'd pay him money to come down to Mississippi. Made preparations, loaded a backpack with face paint, gloves, hair nets. Told Tracy he had to cut his hair. Why? Because it leaves evidence. Tracy's testimony. He was feeding Tracy the stuff about Kirby being mean to his son, and he didn't want him to be mean to his daughter, to pump him up, to give Tracy some justification in his mind. This is why I got to go do this. But it didn't work. He didn't do it. Tracy was the talent. He was the talent referred to in that Assassin's Inc. text. Didn't allow Tracy to ever have phones there. Now, this is in evidence is a picture of Kirby's body with his boot exposed. Tracy knew this. Why? Because Jeff Spence told him. Because when he told him he killed him, he said, I left the body uncovered so it could be found. How else would... Y'all saw him testify. He doesn't look like a guy that gets on Facebook every day and, whatever TV show that he said he didn't watch TV. He said he wasn't on social media. So how else would he know that? He said that he didn't even know he really killed him until January 26th when Brad Johnson told him. How else would he know that? Because Jeff Spence told him. All Tracy's information came from Jeff Spence. Now, was some of it inaccurate? Was he shot with a pistol? No. Was he shot in the face? No, but he was shot in the neck. But Tracy didn't know that. He's just going on what Jeff Spence told him. Finally, Tracy said that the next time he saw him after he sat with his dogs, he said he asked him to sit with his dogs while he went on vacation. I submit to you that was probably at Thanksgiving. The next time he saw him, the black Suburban was there loaded down with coins, bags of coins. When was that? That was when all three of them came back after Kirby's funeral on December 20th of 2022. That's when he saw him. And that's when Jeff Spence told him he killed him. Now, Jeff Spence left Kirby Carpenter like that. He killed him in the garage, drug his body around, covered him up so somebody could find him. We have proven our case. He murdered Kirby Carpenter. I'm asking you to find justice for Kirby and his family. He's guilty. Thank you.
And you now may make your close for the speech.
All right, good morning, y'all. That was a lot of information, wasn't it? Tuesday, I told y'all that this case was going to be based on certain people in Kirby Carpenter's family choosing Caitlin as the person who did it. And then they found out, well, they were told she was at Walmart, so now they chose Jeff. And this case was never, Kirby Carpenter's death was never investigated. Jeff was investigated for a year, but Kirby Carpenter's case was never investigated. And I'm sorry I took a long time with some of those witnesses, but I want y'all to hear as many details as possible. But let's start with what's been going on in this case for 3.5 years. Because law enforcement for the past 3.5 years has been under the impression that from the start, oh, Jeff is stealing silver. He came over right after Kirby died and he's putting bags of silver in the trunk. He's changing the safe codes. He's got all this cash in his bank boxes. He must have taken that from Kirby. All these coins. His phone. They've been saying for 3.5 years, Jeff's phone was off all day. That's really suspicious. He turned his phone off when he came down here. It seemed like Chris McAllister found out on Tuesday that that's not the case. Been saying that for 3.5 years, been testifying to that. It's not the case. And then you heard, well, his own daughter's going to testify that he told her he did it. And we'll talk about that in a minute, too. This is one of the worst investigations that you will ever see. It really is. Never about solving a murder. It was about trying to see if they could make Jeff fit it. And look, they should have investigated Caitlin and they should have investigated Jeff. That's their job. But they should have investigated everybody. You know how much information they got within the first week of Kirby's death? That they never even bothered to talk to anybody, make a phone call, nothing. And that all came from Chris McAllister. He was given all of this information, most of it within days. This Ray Palmer we keep talking about, you didn't hear from Ray Palmer. You don't know where he is. He was given this information a day or two after Kirby was killed. That, oh, you know what? Ray Palmer and Kirby had a phone conversation 24 hours before his death. 24 hours before, where Ray Palmer threatened, Kirby had been to a lawyer to sue Ray Palmer. Ray owed at least $100,000. Kirby had been earlier that week to sue him. And then Ray calls the night before Kirby is killed and threatens him. He says, this is the type of money that families get hurt over. Chris McAllister never even talked to him. Never talked to him. That's unacceptable. Never got his phone records, never looked in his house for a shotgun. They never talked to the guy that wrote this note. This is in evidence. David Hancock, the guy who told Kirby he was going to shoot him in the face, over $2,500. Kirby was so scared about it, he wrote it down in a note. Never talked to this guy. And guess what? A couple days after Kirby died, guess who came up to the estate and asked for his $2,500? A year and a half later, he came up there and asked for his $2,500. Never talked to him, never investigated him, never got his phone records. And Chris McAllister's reason for not doing that, he said, well, you know, he's about 70 years old. People in Chattanooga we keep talking about, who, you know, a month or two earlier, before Kirby's death, he'd apparently ripped off, sold him some fake diamonds. We don't even know what those people's names are. We don't know who they are. We didn't even find that out. I bet they didn't even go through Kirby's phone and check and see who he'd been talking to in the couple weeks before his death. They didn't even do that. They're only worried about Caitlin. They're only worried about Jeff. They never talked to Kirby's estranged side of the family. They didn't talk to his dad. They didn't talk to his brother, apparently had been shooting at a couple months prior. And I'm not telling y'all that one of those people did it. Maybe, maybe not. But the case deserved for those people to be investigated, at least for them to go and talk to those people. They never interviewed him. They never asked to. You know who else they never tried to talk to? Jeff. Jeff didn't have a lawyer. They could have said, hey, will you come in and give a statement? Will you give an interview? And he would have either said no and got a lawyer and they would have kept looking, or he would have said, sure, here's my phone. But they never tried. I told you about how they let certain members of Kirby's family run this investigation. That's how they started. That's one of the first pieces of information they're given. They go, well, Caitlin's dad was over here, and we all saw him put bags of silver in the trunk. We know that they changed the safe codes. There's a camera box that's missing. By the way, who found that camera box we keep hearing so much about? Chris McAllister told you that Maddie Jane called him a couple weeks later and said, hey, I found this camera box. That's odd. Called him a couple weeks after that, said, I found a drop of blood. They let them run the investigation. Now, about these bags of silver that they're saying Jeff put in his trunk. Jeff and Karen didn't come down there until about that Saturday around noon. You heard how that house was cleared out starting Friday, starting the night they found the body. Bart Adams, the estate lawyer that you heard from, he was asked, well, who all brought items back for the estate? Who were two of the people he said? He said, oh, Jeff and Caitlin brought stuff back. What else did Bart Adams say? he said the day after they got all the estate stuff together, they moved it to his office, and they moved some stuff to the armory. And he said almost nobody knew where that stuff was going, except for, I think he said, his 2 sons and Maddie Jane. And I think the night of, or the next day, his office was broken into, alarm cords were cut, and all that stuff was stolen out of his office. Same day, somebody went to the armory where the rest of the stuff was. They broke into that. And you heard about that weekend following Kirby's death. There was a posse of just armed people trying to get into the house. And it's interesting because 3 of those people were Kirby's biological father and his 2 brothers, who he hadn't talked to in over a year. They're over there trying to steal stuff from the house. They were never investigated. They were never talked to. You have text messages that are in evidence about why those safe codes were changed, why the locks were changed. And you may not believe what Caitlin Spence had to say. I mean, they believe her. She's their witness. But I do want to talk about James Robert Smith. He's important. You have texts in here from James Robert Smith. First of all, who is he? He's a good friend of Kirby's. Good friend of Kirby's. Such a good friend that testimony was he was at the family Thanksgiving. Okay? Kirby lets him park a camper at his house. Okay? He's Kirby's friend. Text here. James called the cops. He said you could change the locks on the doors because you live here. And he said you can change the codes on the safe. Kirby's friend is in there. And apparently he thinks that this is crazy that everybody's coming over here to loot the house. This is Kirby's friend saying all this. Yet Chris McAllister was told, oh, well, Jeff was stealing stuff out of the house. Jeff's told to start taking pictures, to start videoing anything that leaves the house. We got people taken from the house. People going through these safes that apparently the combinations were changed on. McAllister got phone records from 6 people. He got a search warrant for phone records for just 6 people. The 3 Spences, and then Bailey Reese, or Bailey Hickerson, who is Caitlin's friend, and then her kind of father, Kendall Stevens. Okay? And they did that because, oh, well, they're close to Caitlin. Maybe they had something to do with it. And you know who the 6th person is that they got phone records from? James Robert Smith, Kirby's friend. Why'd they do that? Because the family was mad at him. Because he wasn't letting them go steal Kirby's things.
Objection, Your Honor.
Take Kirby's things.
It's not part of the facts in this case.
I stand the objection. So we're going to agree or destroy anything that don't think is included in the evidence.
You were told about how this caused a rift in Kirby's family. Why? Because Aunt Kay and Uncle Bobby, who raised Kirby at least for a little while, they still go and visit Jeff. They still go talk to him. They're just not on Facebook.
Same objection, Your Honor.
We heard about that.
Okay.
So they investigate Jeff for an entire year. They're never trying to figure out who is responsible. They're just trying to see if they can prove it's him. So for an entire year almost, nothing happens. Nothing. And then Chris McAllister talks to David Barnes. David Barnes is the entire reason that he's arrested. You never heard from David Barnes. But Chris McAllister says David Barnes got in trouble about a year later. He broke into about 4 businesses around town. He's looking at nearly life in prison. They bring him in for an interview. McAllister didn't realize he was high on meth apparently during that interview, but they grill him. They grill him for a couple hours. And what's he say that day? Nothing about Jeff. Matter of fact, McAllister agreed that what he was told by David Barnes that day was that David thought that it was either Ray Palmer or Jerry Carpenter, Kirby's dad. So then they arrest David Barnes, bring him back the next day, grill him for a couple more hours. Tell us what you know. And finally he goes, well, last year at Kirby's funeral, Caitlin told me that her dad did it. Apparently, Kirby and David Barnes are best friends. So he knew who killed his best friend for a year and he never said anything? Did they talk to anybody else who was at the funeral? A lot of people at the funeral. Did they talk to any of them? Did they find a single person who said, yeah, I saw David Barnes talk to Caitlin at the funeral? They don't need any other information. A couple of days later, they charge him with capital murder based on what a convicted felon said, based on what a drug addict said, based on what somebody who was looking at nearly life in prison said, based on what somebody who stole from a church and then tried to burn it down and also tried to destroy the security cameras at the church. That's why he's arrested. The most important thing about David Barnes is that you never heard from him. You didn't see those interviews. They never called him to testify. He's the one who's responsible for this arrest. You never heard from him. Let's talk about the phones for a minute. Chris McAllister got a search warrant for Jeff's call records about 2 weeks after the murder. This is in evidence. This is the search warrant he got. The search warrant where he tells Verizon, hey, send me Jeff's phone records. I want to check them. Because remember, he's testified several times about this case, under oath, that Jeff's phone was off that day. This is a piece of paper asking for those phone records. You know what's not here? The phone records. It seemed like he just saw those phone records for the first time on Tuesday. Seemed like he just realized that Jeff made 14 calls and sent 11 text messages throughout the day that Kirby Carpenter was killed. He learned that on Tuesday. Now, we can't tell from those records who Jeff called or who he was texting. But we do have Karen's phone. We have Karen's phone where we can see that Jeff sent her and Caitlin a text message the day Kirby was killed in the afternoon, where they would have been able to track his phone had they looked. But what did McAllister say about those phone records? I think I asked him, are you basing the fact that his phone was off on those call records? And he said, well, I guess not. I'm basing them off of the information we got from Jeff's phone extraction, from his phone dump. Because they extracted Jeff's phone about 13 months after Kirby was killed. About a year and a month. And he says he didn't have any phone activity for that day. And that was suspicious. You heard from Scott Watson, who actually extracted these phones, about how the type of model or whatever that Jeff's phone was, stuff starts to get deleted off of it to clear the memory off. It gets overwritten after about a year. So we can see all of Jeff's text, all of his calls, the content of his messages. Every time you send a text message, they can tell where you are. It gets your GPS. But after about a year, the phone deletes all that stuff to save memory. So what Chris McAllister had been looking at were the phone records that went beyond from around the time that Kirby was killed. And it also seemed like he found out for the first time on Tuesday that Jeff's phone, because it was extracted so late, it only recorded his GPS when he took a picture. He didn't take any pictures the day that Kirby was killed. And when you go through this, it shows his GPS every time he took a picture. And it's got the date on it. And McAllister's right. There's no pictures taken. He didn't take any pictures the day Kirby died. There's also about 10 other dates in here where there's no phone activity. That doesn't mean that Jeff had his phone off. That means he didn't take a picture that day. You can flip through this. There are gaps in this. Some days he took a bunch of pictures. There's a lot of those dates on here. There's 2-day gaps in here, 3-day gaps in here, everywhere. You have this in evidence. But that's been one of their main pieces of evidence. For 3.5 years, Jeff's phone was off, so he couldn't be tracked. His phone was on, and he was active on his phone. They proved to you through that tag reader that Jeff was 450 miles away the day Kirby died. Where were all the other suspects? Probably a lot closer than that. And they want to say, well, if he was driving south from Saltville, he could have made it there in time to do it. You know what we don't have? Any tag reader any closer than that. So if he drove 450 miles and made it to Tippa, and then drove 500 and something miles back, don't you think he'd be on another tag reader in any direction? We know he drives around a lot. We know he does the bees. We know he, does the Facebook cars, stuff like that. That van location they showed y'all, that's about 50 miles away from his home in Saltville. That would be like y'all driving from here to about Tupelo and them saying, that's suspicious. What are you doing in Tupelo so far away? Okay, he's in northeast Tennessee. And that's what that proves to y'all. He's not on a single other tag reader. And you know what they didn't probably check? Tag readers in the other direction. They're not investigating this case. Because if they found him on a tag reader north of where he lives, well, that wouldn't, then they'd have to start over. They'd have to investigate somebody else. And they're still investigating. They went 2 months ago. They went to Jeff's neighborhood, his old neighborhood in Saltville. They talked to 6 or 7 people because they were wanting to know about the van. Ah, that's really creepy that the van got demolished. It must have had evidence in it. What evidence? And that's when they talked to James Harper. McAllister was also asked about him. He's the tow truck driver who came and picked up the van for Jeff to take it to the scrapyard. And James says, yeah, Jeff, I see Jeff all the time. He calls me all the time to take stuff away. He's always fixing on cars. He's got junk in his yard. I'm always taking stuff away from him. And they asked these 6 or 7 people about Jeff. And they all knew him. And then they say, well, who we're really looking for is this Tracy Delp guy. And they all said, why in the world would you want to talk to Tracy Delp? We'll talk about him for a minute. He was our most fun witness. If he had a television show, I'd watch it. Tracy got up here and he told you, I've been sober for 10 years. I'm sober as a judge. Well, when they talked to him 2 months ago, they interviewed him at a rehab. He's a convicted felon. He lies to the police, but he's shooting y'all straight. Jeff offered him $100,000 to go kill Kirby. Yet this case is about a robbery. Does that make sense? What else did he say? Jeff told him he waited in the basement. Kirby doesn't have a basement. Told him he waited there for almost a day. That would be impossible. Did it with a pistol. Not true. Yeah, he came back in a Suburban after he did it. Who drives a Suburban? Kate. He came back in a Suburban after Caitlin and them had moved back to Virginia about a month later. What he knows about the boot. Claims he's never seen this on TV. The guy who he says he's good friends with tells him he killed a guy and he never looked it up on the internet. Never saw it. And let's talk about all these bank boxes for a second. Because y'all might be thinking, wow, look at all this evidence we have. Because they went into all his personal property and they pulled anything they could find out. And what they're trying to say is look at all these coins in here. Look at all these coins. These must be Kirby's coins. They went in Jeff's storage unit. Look at all this junk in there. Is any of this in these boxes? No, because they cherry picked. They said, oh, here's some coins. This will make them look guilty. Let's bring those down. And they want to say, oh, he had cash in there. And that's Kirby's cash. Well, we know $20,000 of cash in there came from a bank in Richmond, Virginia in 2021, unopened. About a year longer before Kirby died. So Jeff's got $20,000 in there that he hasn't touched, yet he needs to go and rob Kirby. What else do we find in there? Luckily, and this is something else that we learned on Tuesday, this gold coin was in these storage boxes. Luckily, we went back and we could see a text on Caitlin's phone because it saved text for longer. This very gold bar, this very same one, Jeff sent a picture to his daughter. March of 2021. Is that crazy that a guy he's into the same things as Kirby, okay? And it doesn't sound like that Kirby and Jeff had any kind of problem with each other, you know? Kirby didn't write any notes about Jeff. They were into the same, they bonded over the coins, over trading. And the other thing, they want to say, look, how creepy is it that he wrapped all this money in foil? It must have been Kirby's. And it is weird. But he wrote on here, $10,000, 12 pup, Valentine 21. And luckily, we can go back and check the phone on that. And you have this in evidence. What did Jeff do around Valentine's Day in 2021? He sold a bunch of German Shepherd puppies. The other thing that tells you is that $10,000 is Jeff's, and that he hasn't touched it. He hadn't touched it since 2021. Now, I can't prove to y'all that every single thing in this box belongs to Jeff, just the things that happen to be stored in phones from years ago. But nothing that's in these boxes really matters. Because you know who a lot of the stuff in the boxes belongs to? Caitlin. There's an auction receipt in one of these boxes where after Kirby's death, a couple months later, Caitlin buys some things from the estate. She buys things to remember him by. She buys a lot of coins. And they end up in these storage boxes. And I'm honestly surprised that there's not more of Kirby's stuff in these boxes. Because Caitlin, Jeff's daughter, was in a relationship with him for about 3 years. Is that crazy that somebody's basically father-in-law would have a couple things that belonged to his essentially son-in-law? It's Caitlin's stuff in here. There's a coin in here that has the date of 2023 on it. So why would he need to go murder Kirby to take all of his money and his coins when he's got, at least that we can prove, $30,000 in here that he hadn't touched since 2021? Now let's talk about Caitlin and what she said for a minute. I'm sorry, I've been taking so many water breaks this week. What did Caitlin say? Well, first of all, Caitlin is not on trial. So luckily, it's not your job to say whether Caitlin's guilty or not. Now, they don't think she had anything to do with any kind of planning or anything like that, because they let her plead guilty to accessory after the fact, which means they believe that she didn't have anything to do with planning this. She didn't know it was going to happen. By the way, does this make any sense? That Jeff's doing his daughter a favor? He would go over there and kill her boyfriend and then leave his body there, making her the prime suspect? Does that make any sense at all? Now, Caitlin sat in jail for a year and a half. She sat in jail. She had a lawyer from, 5 days after. 5 days after Kirby was killed, she has a lawyer. She goes and hires Tony Faris. She sits in jail. Who's trying to take her daughter? Who's trying to get custody of her daughter while she's in jail? Maddie Jane. So, look, she's given so many statements about this. From the only statement she gave without a lawyer was when she talked to Tammy Hall the day of. Every other statement she's given was with Tony Farice. Nothing about any of her statements has ever changed. They're all remarkably consistent. Until she goes in with her lawyer and says, okay, now we'll tell you what really happened. And then she gives the exact same story. And the only thing that changed was, my dad kind of told me he did it when we were at a waterfall. What happens after that? She pleads guilty, agrees to testify to that, one additional fact, and a day or two after she pleads guilty, she gets out of jail. She gets to see her daughter for the first time in a year and a half. I don't blame her for that. Ask yourself if you feel comfortable with this investigation. Were your questions answered? Were enough of your questions answered to where you can feel confident to convict a man of murder? I mean, it's scary that people could get charged with murder based on something a guy said after a 5-hour interview, 2-day interview. It's not fair for them to ask y'all to convict somebody after this investigation, after this lack of investigation. Like, they found out no information about anybody other than Jeff. They didn't look into anybody. Remember, I told you it's not your job to solve this case. That was their job. That was their job, to investigate everybody and to bring you a good case and say, you can feel comfortable with this because we looked into everything. Ask yourself if you feel comfortable with what you heard this week. I think we have more questions than answers. If you have a bunch of questions, you can't convict somebody of murder. And you may feel like, well, if we don't convict him, that wouldn't be justice. We really want justice in this case. Sure, that's a normal thing to feel. But justice is not convicting somebody because a few people in Kirby's family want that person convicted. Tell them to go back and actually investigate this case. Figure out who did it, find good proof, investigate all of these people. That is justice. And what you've seen this week didn't really prove anything. It's not your job to solve it. That was their job. It is not fair to you for them to ask you to do this. Thank you.
Everybody good on the jury? Everybody good? You got just a little over 19 minutes.
19 minutes. Thank you, Honor.
Thank y'all for a long time.
Just a couple of things. Number one, when Mr. McNeil made opening statements, he said, Caitlin's grieving and Kirby's family is going through their stuff. Thank you. And stealing everything of value. Stealing. And then he got up, went and questioned the witnesses. That family was over there. They came like a posse. And I just want you to stop and think about what's happening. Mattie Jane just lost her son. She came to her son's house, found his body covered with a tarp, with a toolbox put over it. Who was grieving? Family was. Now, Caitlin was living in the house. But whose property is it? Whose property was all that in the safe? And I want you to remember that Caitlin said to y'all, who had the combinations to the safe? Do you remember? Remember what she said? Maddie Jane had the combinations to the safe. Who did Kirby trust with the property? And whose property was it? Well, you know, at the time of Kirby's death, it wasn't Caitlin's. It was his children's. He didn't have a will. It was Cam's, his son, and Enola. And what would have happened to all of that during this time where they're, you know, can you imagine trying to process the death of your, you know, someone who had been violently, you know, killed in his own garage? His body was dragged out and covered with a tarp, put on a, I mean, it's, where would everything have gone if they hadn't shown up? And what did they do? You know, they tried. Mr. McNeil tried to. Well, he did introduce pictures of Jeff Spence with a phone. This man with a phone in Kirby Carpenter's house, in his residence that he bought with his hard-earned money, with all of his stuff, and he was successful, but it was his. And he was following Maddie Jane and Casey around with a phone while they had, you know, taken some items because they had to leave. They were leaving it with Kate and Jeff and Karen. And she had already seen that the Cadillac was loaded with silver coins. Did he earn all that? Did he earn those silver coins that were in his silver Cadillac? But that's where they were. And when they called law enforcement out, hey, you know, time out. Time out. This is not going down like this. Where did the guns that you got a picture of Maddie Jane taking the guns out of the house? Where did they end up? They ended up in the estate. They didn't end. It wasn't robbery. It wasn't theft by Kirby's mom. That's absurd. And that's what they're trying to do. And they're doing a good job. Muddy the water, make it unclear. You know, if you go out to the crime scene as an investigator, you know, there's some primary things to consider. Follow the money. You know, number one. Number two is, you know, does this look like a crime of opportunity? You know, that somebody with a grudge, somebody wanting to steal, get back at Kirby. I mean, that was at his house. Somebody would have had access to the home. Somebody would have had access to the surveillance cameras. You know, and then, you know, pay attention because the judge is giving you instructions on how to evaluate, weigh the credibility of the witnesses. And the judge has to determine what you get to hear first. And Carolyn came in and testified. My dad said, you know, if I was ever going to kill somebody, I'd use a shotgun so it wouldn't leave a shell. The judge allowed that in for a purpose, for you to consider. This is his own daughter, Carolyn, that didn't have anything to gain. She's not, you know, making a plea deal with the state. The reason she's here is because of her experience with her father, and she was scared for her family, so she lives so that he will never find out where they are for a reason. And that is important for you to consider and weigh the credibility of her testimony, because she said,
Judge, I'm sorry. I think this is outside the scope of my close.
that doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter in Mississippi.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I don't have to follow him. I have to follow the proof. And Carolyn's proof is important. It's important because she and her husband were talking, and they said, you know what? Jeff and Karen have been there with this, we don't know Kirby, but with Caitlin, the baby has been born, we may want to check on him, maybe warn him. And so they began to look it up, and you know what they find out? They found out that Kirby had been killed. I mean, they were following their instinct. What else did she say? He was very particular about his phone. If he had to travel out of state, he'd leave his phone with Karen, so it couldn't be tracked. You've got proof from the phone dump. Yeah, it was a year later. There was activity on that phone on November the 29th. No activity from operator input on November the 30th. This is on the Cellbrite download. And then on December the 1st, there's a lot of activity because he's using his phone. And you heard Caitlin testify that, it was unusual. She got one text. Her parents had just gone back to Virginia. She saw him leave November 30th that afternoon, 2:30. And then the next day, she hadn't heard from her dad. And she gets an explanation. My battery was out or my phone was broken. That's why she said, I didn't receive any text from him. So, the data is in evidence. And you can look at it, but it was testified that there was no activity and that he used an old iPhone. Old iPhone, the only thing I can think of is it's got one of those, what do you call them? Cards. SIM card. Maybe, yeah, that's the only thing I can think of to explain that one text that came through. But it was interesting, if you look at that, it wasn't read until a day later. So that Cellbrite would be on the phone that was left in Virginia. Now, with respect to the investigation, here's what law enforcement knew. All right, first of all, and this goes to quality of the evidence and what your responsibility is. And I'll help you a little bit. On the capital murder, we don't have to prove intent. That's the law. I think motive and intent is really an important part of the case. But it's not legally required for us to prove that. If someone is killed and something is taken. In this case, investigators knew that Kirby Carpenter carried that manly leather bag with him everywhere he went. He'd been working that day, and he had that leather bag with him because he carried it with him everywhere he went. And what was contained in it was valuable. It was cash, because that was his line of work. And it was receipts for the business that he conducted. Okay? He also carried a .22 pistol with him everywhere he went. That was because of what he did for a living. There was never found in that house or on the scene that was roped off a leather bag or that gun. Whoever killed Kirby took that because he never left home without it, but it was never found. I believe even though we don't have the leather bag or the .22 to show you in evidence that you can take back there into the room, that there's no other reasonable explanation other than that. What else? Law enforcement knew that this home was this man's fortress, and it had lots of valuables in it, valuables that are worth a lot of money. Had safes, multiple safes, with valuables in it. There were surveillance cameras around that property, including in the garage. The door was locked. Kirby, when he got home, because of the evidence, you've got a receipt found in his truck, locked, Kroger, with a bag of groceries that he had gotten that included lamb chops. Those lamb chops were still in there when the investigation began a couple of days later, on December the 2nd. From November the 30th to December 2nd, the lamb chops stayed in his truck, never made it inside. Kirby never made it inside. He was shot in the garage, and then you heard the testimony about his body being moved, and that's interesting too, if you're going to talk about, oh, somebody else did it. If somebody just had it out for Kirby, why move his body around the side, cover him up with a tarp, and put a toolbox on him? I mean, deed's done, go. Left cash in his pocket, $2,000. One of the disputes was about $2,000. You know, and that brings up the other question about the legal, the civil case that was going to be filed against the guy that owed him money. Does killing somebody resolve that? That survives. He still owes the money. Killing doesn't resolve that. But if you had told your daughter, hey, you may want to make sure you're not around tomorrow night, go out on a girls' night out, take a NOLA, take Bailey. Y'all go to the Mexican restaurant and, take a little time in Boonville. Don't be around about the time you get off work and about the time Kirby is returning. What else did investigators have? They had Caitlin, agreeing to talk. Then, hey, can you come in Monday morning and we'll do a, formal interview with you. And she said, yeah, I'll be there Monday morning. She didn't show up. Didn't show up. It was getting to be about time to go home. And she shows up. But she shows up with Tony Farice. Okay. 911 call. They listened to the 911 call of Caitlin. And that time of that 911 call is important because I think it's around 12:30 when that's made. There's Kirby's body. Kate's been, that's her residence that she's living in, even though she's not on the title and hadn't discovered him yet. There's a dog inside that, the dog didn't go outside. Didn't, it's just hard for law enforcement to, it's suspicious. 911 call, Caitlin's demeanor is silence. While, as soon as you place the 911 call, it begins to record, even though 911 operator hadn't answered. Calm. As soon as 911, what's your emergency? Whoa! Then, later on, law enforcement gets called out. There's all this property and you got two sides and whose is it? What's going on? What do they do? They keep the peace and lawyers get involved. That part of it is a red herring. It's muddy in the water. Doesn't matter. Yeah, I think it's important because it shows they're trying to put, thousands of dollars worth of gold coins in his Cadillac that he didn't earn. Without any kind of oversight whatsoever, he just took it upon himself. And then he wants to blame them and record them while they're trying to document everything and secure it for the estate. Weird. Not Not real cool. And then later on, after the service on the 17th, on the 20th, Chris McAllister goes out. He sees a hunting camera. It's posted out there. Who put it out there? That man right there. Surveillance cameras. That's another reason Carolyn's testimony is important and why the judge allowed it. Because when they were having the same problems with him, what did he do when he came over to their property? Cut the surveillance. Cut the surveillance. Similar. Knows, were particular about his phone, particular about his cameras. Hiding, manipulating what his movements are going to be and what he's going to do. Yeah, I mean, if you're investigating someone who's covering up, it's difficult. And talk about beehives in Tennessee. Are you kidding me? You've got a van coming southbound 8:30 in the morning on November the 30th with his tag on it that ends up on January weeks.
You got 2 minutes to speak.
2 months later, ends up burned and being crushed. Plus, a few weeks before that, he had gotten full coverage on it. Could have claimed it. Didn't, because it raised red flags. Yeah, covering up his actions. And then David Barnes, another red herring. Yeah, David Barnes, they beehive. I'm going to connect those two. I don't have very long, and I've got a lot to say. They could have called anybody. They could have called the property owner. They've got subpoenas, power.
Judge, that's burden shifting.
No, they brought it up. They're the one that told you about, hey, well, he went to a beehive in Tennessee.
It's their case, they got to put witnesses on.
I'm equally tested. I'm going to allow name card.
They could have called that property owner. Yeah, he had a
Can I
beehive.
request that the court re-instructs the jury that it's the state's burden to prove their case?
I'm court going to have to instruct the jury, but
Thank you, Your Honor.
They noticed the state on an alibi months ago. That alibi was Tracy Delp. They gave us that information.
Judge, again, that's a misstatement.
That is not a mistake.
That was previous attorneys did that, not us.
rephrase your statement.
Previous attorneys gave us that
Previous
information.
attorneys did it, but he keeps saying that we did it. We didn't do it. It's a
His
mistake.
defense.
Hang on. Rephrase it to say it's the defense, not these particular guys.
His defense lawyers, not these particular guys, but where did those defense lawyers get that information from? Tracy Delp in Virginia? You think David Hill in Oxford, Mississippi had any idea who Tracy Delp was? No. They got that information from Jeff Spence. Jeff Spence said, he's my alibi. He knows I was there. And we looked for him and couldn't find him. And when we found him, he said, Jeff Spence told me he killed Kirby Carpenter. Caitlin Spence told you, my father killed Kirby Carpenter. She knows who did it. She told you. Carolyn Spence believes, she testified against her own father, believes that this man took this gun, for which, where was this shotgun? With mud on it. It was under his bed, and he called his brother Doug and he said, hey, go look under the bed and get my coat. Because this man was driving down the road
Judge, that's time.
toward Ripley and laid in wait for Kirby to come home and shot and killed him with it. Caitlin knows it. Carolyn knows it. Tracy Delp knows it. Everybody in this courtroom knows it. And it's now time for you to weigh their credibility. 2 daughters testifying against their father because they know what he did. Or let him get away with murder.
You can't